This is the fog, or how we control accommodation for V551 ocular motility and refraction. Looking at this classical chart of accommodation, how it changes with age, from Duane's, what we can easily see is that at younger ages, there is a large amount of amplitude of accommodation. What is amplitude of accommodation, you might ask? That's the total amount a person can accommodate. Now, at younger ages, that could be 13, 14, 15 diopters, and that over time decreases. But from the ages of 8 to 30, there's a substantial amount of accommodation, anywhere from between 6 to 14, 15 diopters. Now, by the time we reach 40s, we've reduced our accommodation to the point where we can no longer see up close effectively. And by 60s, we have no accommodation effectively at all. It's largely just depth of focus at that point. And this is due to changes in the lens size, shape, as well as some of the index of refraction as cataracts develop. As we can see here, we have 4 lenses, and as they age, the lens gets thicker, the lens becomes a little more curved, but ultimately it gets thicker and bigger, and that makes it harder and harder to move that lens to change the power of it. Well, we can measure our amplitude of accommodation. One of those techniques is with the near point of accommodation. Near point of accommodation is a measure of the accommodative amplitude, or essentially how much a person can accommodate. Similar to working distances, it can be converted to diopters by dividing 1 by the distance in meters. As an example, NPA, their near point of accommodation, might be 10 centimeters. With that, that means the patient has approximately 10 diopters of accommodation, or 1 divided by 0.1 meters equals 10 diopters. The big point, though, of this is that any minus lens given to the patient that is less than the patient's amplitude of accommodation can appear clear to the patient. That's because they add plus to compensate for the minus. And this will result in them seeing 20/20, even though you've changed the prescription quite a bit. What happens during accommodation? Well, as the eye, or as the lens becomes more accommodated, it becomes more curved. It also becomes thicker, and it also starts to move slightly forward. And this only can increase plus power in the eye. All the eye can add when it accommodates is plus power. It can't compensate in the opposite direction. It also means that it cannot clear vision if the image is already in front of the retina. The eye is overpowered in that situation. Adding more plus does not help it to see better. And that's where the fog comes into play when we refract people. You might ask, is it when you wear your mask during COVID-19? Absolutely not. What the fog is the use of plus lens power to move the image in front of the retina, thereby blurring the patient and controlling accommodation. Once we've added that plus in front of the eye and moved the image in front of the retina, it doesn't matter if the patient accommodates. If they accommodate, they can only see worse. So their objective would be to have the clearest possible vision is to minimize accommodation. And that's the ultimate job of what the fog is to control accommodation using plus blur. It's fairly simple and fairly straightforward. The critical components to fogging properly are adding enough plus until at least 20/30 cannot be read. And the reason why you need to take it to 20/30 to 20/40 is there's still things like depth of focus and other things that will give you a wrong reading unless you add more plus. The second thing, and the most critical thing, is you must actually take acuity. Do not ask subjectively if the 20/30 is clear, because you'll get a wide range of answers that are not accurate to dictate whether you've truly blurred out the 20/30 line. You must take the acuity and assure that they cannot read 20/30. What are some end results of improper fogging or over-minusing a patient? In children, you could be driving axial elongation. In adults, it can induce eye strain at distance and or near. And ultimately, you can cause blurry vision that's usually worse at near than distance. Let's look at some examples of fogging a patient. In this example, we have a -2 myope. They're 20 years old, having come in without their glasses, so we don't know what their prescription actually is when we're seeing them. They see 2100 at distance and 20/20 at near. It kind of matches up with our -2 lenses. You read a -2, which is exactly what their prescription is. If we add 3 clicks of plus, or 0.75, the RX in the phoropter becomes -1.25, and their VA through that fog is now 20/40. As we've learned previously, 1 click of sphere power equates to 1 line of acuity loss. Because we've added 3 clicks, they will be approximately around 2040. That might be give or take a letters. They might see a few letters at 2030, or they might not be able to read 2040 at all, but 3 clicks of plus should take them in the range of 2040. Now this is an example of a perfect case where you nailed the retinoscopy, you've added just simple 3 clicks of plus, and the fog has done exactly what you expect it to do. At this point, you can progress through refraction normally. Let's look at another example of a 2-diopter hyperope in this situation. Again, they're 20 years old, so they've got plenty of amplitude of accommodation left. And that's why when you actually measure their acuities, they're relatively still clear no matter what, because they can accommodate through that hyperopia without their prescription. Now in this case, you only read though out a +1 diopter, so you've missed that other diopter of plus. When you add in your +75, they are still very close to their distance prescription, so through this fog of just 0.75, they see 20/20. This is an example where the fog has not been added properly. In this situation, you need to add even more plus till you get them to 20/40. So we add another +75 or +1 diopter, and what you'll find is their acuity will then drop finally to 20/40, and you can progress through refraction. Let's take that example of a 2-diopter hyperope, but this time with presbyopia. They're 60 years old. They have no accommodation. This is a very different situation from that previous one. In this situation, their VAs are terrible because they don't have the accommodation left to correct their vision. In this case, you can actually read pretty close to their prescription, which is +2 diopters. And when you add that 75 in there, you get the appropriate fog of 20/40. So this patient, because he's the same hyperope as before, but with or without accommodation, really matters on what you see through the fog and how much plus ultimately you need to add to the fog to blur them properly. So again, to kind of emphasize this one last time, what's the difference between these two patients? The big difference between these two and the results of the fog are accommodation. With accommodation, you need to add more plus sometimes to ensure you fogged properly. Let's look at that hyperope one last time, though, that presbyopic hyperope one more time in 2 conditions. What happens if you miss your ret on a presbyope and you underplus them? In this case, they're all identical up to the point of your objective lens or your retinoscopy lens. In one situation, your retinoscopy is +2, in the other it's +125. Now, if you add +75 to the +2, you'll have a proper fog. When you come out of retinoscopy at 1.25, though, the patient's already blurred to 20/40 without adding anything at all. Now, why does this happen? Ultimately, the number 2 situation is wrong, and you don't know it because the VA is actually 20/40, which is your objective, but it's because you're on the wrong side of the prescription. In this situation, +1/4 and -1/4 blur equally when you don't have accommodation. So what you'd need to do is really add more plus. And this is an example here where the optimal focus or the optimal visual acuity is at 2 diopters. But if you're 0.75 off in either direction, the patient will see 20/30, 20/40, but you're in the wrong location. So if you've underplus somebody, sometimes check to make sure extra plus doesn't make vision better. Thank you.